your eyes. I don't think he's gonna.
Ann, how's Michael doing?
He's doing very well, thank you. He just celebrated his birthday
I
a couple
know
days ago.
he just had a birthday.
Yeah, he had a good time.
That's good.
I got him a cake that was decorated with the New York Mets medallion on it, so he was thrilled.
That may be all he sees of the Mets this year.
That's right.
Yeah, I always enjoy my Metropolitan's conversations with Michael.
Yeah.
A team we much prefer to the Washington Nationals.
Right.
Yeah, that was intentionally provocative and a weak effort to be funny.
That woke Joe up.
Just want to see if you were paying attention, Joe.
This is a Max Scherzer bobblehead. So everybody should know how important these guys are to me.
Yes, I saw Max Scherzer pitch a couple years ago when I was in Washington, D.C. for a meeting, and I went to see a game.
We were there one day. He was 1 out away from a perfect game.
Wow.
The batter, a Pittsburgh Pirate, many assert, intentionally leaned into the pitch so that it would hit him, and it did.
Oh.
And that it ruined the perfect game. The next guy hit a pop-up, the game ended. It was a no-hitter, but it ruined the perfect game.
Oh.
Yep.
So who is the Pittsburgh Pirate? Do you remember him?
No, I don't.
My Detroit Tiger fan regret they let Scherzer go many years ago, unfortunately.
The Tigers have done that a lot.
They
Like
have.
the other guys,
they have.
yep. Probably a money issue. The rich and the poor of the owners.
Yeah, yeah.
It's good to see we got some baseball fans. We may forget the sport pretty soon.
I'm skeptical that they're going to play this week, which they
Yeah.
or next week, I guess. Next week they're supposed to start.
Yeah.
I'm skeptical.
Yep. So's my husband.
Each team is going to play the 4 others in their division 4 times. So that's 10 times. So that's 40 games. And then the other 20 are going to be interleague games.
Assuming they play.
But they will not have much travel. In other words, the AL Central will be against the NL. That kind of thing.
Right, exactly. Cut down on airplane travel.
Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, and what, Kansas City?
No, yeah, it is Kansas City. Right.
The very first game, opening day, the very first game will be the Yankees and the Nationals. By the way, on my birthday, I'm very appreciative that they recognized that.
That was very considerate of them.
Opening day.
Considerate.
It's going to be in
But
Yankee Stadium, right?
I remain skeptical that they'll actually play it. I think it
It's
is.
going to be in DC.
I think New York, but I don't even know.
Well, it is that time. Welcome, everybody. We are glad I'm glad you're here. So thank you. A couple quick announcements. If you'll go ahead and mute yourself.
John, it's Susan. Before we do, I have a friend and neighbor who's visiting us for the first time this morning, Colleen Slocum. I'd like to welcome Colleen.
Hi, Colleen. Glad
Hello.
you're here.
Her screen says Chris, but she's Colleen.
Thank
Welcome.
you.
We're glad you're here.
Happy to be
Welcome.
here.
So I'll go ahead and ask you to mute yourself. Just a quick announcements. If you'll see in the chat, Robert won't be able to be with us today. He is helping to host the 9:45 service this morning. So he unfortunately will not be with us. I have a just a couple things for you. Hopefully you can see my computer screen. Next Sunday, not in 2 Sundays, our very last class, which is July 26th, the Reverend Jimmy Hawkins, who is the head of the Presbyterian Office for Public Witness in Washington, D.C., or you'll hear it called just the Washington office, will be leading our class live. He's in Washington, but will be Zooming in with us to lead the class. He is a very engaging speaker. If you have not had the opportunity to hear him before. So it was, I'm very excited. I've known Jimmy for a long time and never had the idea that he would actually be available to lead class. I'd actually asked him to do a video and he said he would rather lead class for us. So I'm very excited on that. One other thing for us in our video today by Terry LeBlanc, he uses the word and the language of eschaton. That is a fancy church word for eschatology, which basically means end of time. So you would know that as the book of Revelation, kind of what happens, the final judgment. But that kind of understanding of end times also comes up in the Old Testament, especially in the book of Daniel. So when you hear that, we just wanted to make sure you weren't left scratching your head. During the discussion today, it's going to be led by Glenette Papovich. I have to step out. I'm in worship today and have to help Peter get ready for that. So you all are in great hands. So I'm gonna get ready and we are going to share our video.
Human beings like to create institutions in their own image and likeness. I mean, we think hierarchically, many of us, not all of us, but many of us think hierarchically, and so we want the church to resemble our thinking. I mean, we could argue historically the church becomes hierarchical in the 300s under Constantine as the Edict of Milan is proclaimed, and as Christianity becomes the formal state religion after having had its sanction lifted, and takes on the form and structure of the Roman Empire with the hierarchies that are resident in the Roman Empire, and takes on the thinking patterns and philosophies of the Greek influencers of the day. I mean, we could say that's where those kinds of ideas emerge, and we embrace them readily because they allow us to create a structure that's understandable, manageable, whatever the case may be. Patterns and systems are fine, provided that they don't become oppressive. And that's been, of course, the challenge, is that patterns and systems become in and of themselves quite oppressive. And they, instead of being liberative structures and understandings, they turn into the means by which people are enslaved. I mean, our conversation here around racism and enslavement and so forth, those kinds of things have happened throughout the globe. They're not unique to North America. They're not at all unique to America. They are they're part of the fabric of human societies around the globe, to enslave people and to racially classify, as we would say today, although they wouldn't be described in terms of racial terms perhaps in days gone by, but there would certainly be classifications. Some are better than others, and some are more important than others, and some have greater value than others, and so forth. And the church has certainly done that with the hierarchical structures that it has embraced, moving away from more flat structures or organic structures. Again, moving from organic to and dynamic to more static, more rigid structures has been a challenge. As people will say, race is a construction, but because it's a continuing construction, it's a reality. Even though in terms of the human beings are human beings who may have different tinctures of skin, different tones of skin, different colors of skin, different physiognomy, different featuring, et cetera. Human beings are human beings, but we've constructed the idea of race, and so it's become very real. People say race isn't real. Well, it is real because we've constructed it, and we refer to it, and we make reference on a regular basis to different racial groups. So we've made it real. The work of the church is to, as it were, I think, look at the Imago Dei, the image of God in all of humanity, resident in all of humanity by reason of being created beings, contained within those created beings by reason of the indwelling of the Spirit of God, and ask some questions then again about the nature of the body of Christ, the nature of the church. How do each of us, with our different featuring, our different colorations, our different skills, gifts, callings, etc., create that one organic reality that responds both automatically and autonomically, and also then in a very fluid way to the needs around us. I think that's what we're really being invited to do, and it strikes me that in that sense, race becomes something that we acknowledge has been a divisive force, and now seek to sublimate to the fact that the body of Christ, if you were to sort of visualize a single body, the body of Christ contains all of those images of humanity within it. And so when you look at Christ, you don't see that blonde-haired, blue-eyed Jesus that you see in European images, but rather we should see a Christ that contains the African, the African-American, the Euro-Canadian, the Euro-American, the European, the Asian, the Southeast Asian, we should see the images of Christ in those features and faces and reality, and even in the Texan. Yes, even in the Texan. May it ever be so, even in the Texan. But again, some of the trajectory we're on today, whether it be the church or otherwise, is largely dependent on the starting point. And starting point really does dictate to a certain extent the direction that you take and the means by which you will pursue that direction. And the church set out on a starting point, from a starting point that situated itself in some less than helpful ways, and as a consequence saw the future as an eschaton where all of the current realities are destroyed and replaced, and to some extent people imagined that might even include people groups that would disappear and be absorbed into a particular body politic that looked like, talked like, walked like, act like, and thought like they did. And so in Canada, for example, in the 1800s, they passed legislation to ensure that was so. The Gradual Civilizations Act dictated that British culture, language, etc., would be the normative focus for the development of Indian people. The Gradual Enfranchisement Act stipulated that at a certain point, given certain qualities and characteristics, being resident in Native Canadian peoples, they would become enfranchised. They would have the right to vote. They would be legitimate citizens, etc. Same here in the United States. Same in South Africa. These legislations that sought to dictate people's identities and cultures and value. Those are all resident in this idea somehow that there is a utopian vision of humanity in the eschaton that looked like, walked like, and talked like Europeans, and that's where the racial constructions ultimately found a very warm and welcoming home. Pardon me?
How are we missing out on God?
Well, I think we're missing out on God in that we imagine, and it's an intriguing thing. In the Hal Lindsey days, the late great Planet Earth, the eschaton was that destruction. This is all going to be destroyed and replaced. So who cares? So the environmental movement says, "Oh my gosh," and the church responds, "Well, it's all going to be destroyed. So, the biggest concern is the soul of the human being. So let's go out and save souls and so forth." But we come to today, and there's a similar sort of ethos, it seems to me, in that many people envision the trajectory to be a utopian trajectory that we create by the work that we do. So we create a different ethos around race. We create a different understanding of the acceptability or lack of acceptability of a particular behavior or pattern or idea or whatever within the human community. So we will create that utopian vision. We will bring in the eschaton, et cetera, et cetera. And I think, the we. But I think somewhere between those two is perhaps a more comfortable reality where God is at work, inviting us to leave the decision about the nature of the eschaton in His capable hands, even as we work to bring about just outcomes by just behaviors and just attitudes and just actions. And justice is not simply about fairness. It's not simply about equality, but it's actually about this thing that the Bible talks about that we struggle with called righteousness, because justice and righteousness are the two sides of one coin. Our justice systems that fail to focus on the delivery of righteous behaviors and decisions and judgments and so forth are not acting justly. And so I think that some of what we need to be engaged in is to ensure that justice and righteousness continue to be conjoined on that one coin, so that as we flip over the righteousness side of the coin, we see on the other side this justice that in fact creates the righteousness that we desire to live in. So it's not a creation of our own, but it's based on this idea that God is at work bringing about God's purposes. The shalom of God, the shalom of the creator of all things, balance and harmony, et cetera, justice and righteousness are integral to that.
You mentioned the gospel. What's the gospel? What is that?
Well,
is that like a brand?
A brand. Yeah, DKNY, and it's a great brand. No. Well, I mean, the gospel is the good news that God Himself entered His own creation, and I'll use unfortunately the masculine pronoun because English doesn't have the gendered language is a struggle. Mi'kmaq, my own people's language is better because it's non-gendered. But so the Creator enters the creators. Let me put it that way. Then we can get rid of the Creator enters the Creator's creation, and for a time becomes a part of that creation. And as He becomes part, there I go again. See, you can't get rid of that thing. As Creator becomes part of Creator's own creation, there is this interesting transformation that takes place. The perfect enters the imperfect and seeds the imperfect with perfection, so that the trajectory towards that perfection can be set in place. So the imperfect that enters because of our first parents' willfulness to break covenant, to destroy the harmony in which all of creation had been made, to cause the shalom of God to be defaced. God enters, and God sets God's self in place as a part of God's own creation, to seed God's self into that creation, the perfect and the imperfect, bringing forth the abundance of perfection again, the righteousness and justice. So the gospel is about proclaiming that good news, that we needn't live in the imperfection, but we can live into the restoration of harmony and balance, the shalom of God. We can live into that. We can choose, because of the Spirit's indwelling, because of the work of Christ, his person, work, life, teaching, death, and resurrection, we can live into the realization of the intent of God from the very beginning.
Christ, you say Christ's work, what is that? That's the dude that died on the cross or whatever?
That's the dude that died on the cross, yes.
Did Christ do something on the cross that we couldn't do for ourselves?
Well, again, our first parents, see, this is where people talk about our first parents committing a sin. They actually didn't commit a sin, they simply broke the covenant. So it wasn't a legal, moral issue. They broke the covenant, they broke relationship. And in breaking relationship, there are these three layers of relationship, and the multiple underscored layers within them that are damaged. And so they become less than the perfection in which they were created. And in order to restore them without completely effacing the whole thing and destroying it, which God said God would never do again, never seek to do again, although arguably I don't think it was about destruction anyway, it was about cleansing and purification in the flood narrative. God's decision not to destroy it completely and start all over again, it requires that somehow the perfection be reintroduced, so that, very much like you put good seed in the garden to produce a good crop, very much like Jesus' parable, the wheat and the tares, the good wheat sown in the soil, other stuff growing up with it. So you seed this good seed, and the good seed is the perfection of the life of a human being who would live into and renew the harmony and shalom of God. And that's what Christ did, as he gave his perfect life for the imperfect, that it might be again made perfect. That's great news.
Okay.
All right. Glenette?
Well, there was a lot, I think, to discuss in there, and I thought we might start with how does our construct of race impact the image that we see of God?
Gwinnett, I think we want to see God as we see ourselves, in our image, instead of seeing ourselves in the image of God. And I think it's because we can't fully comprehend the magnitude, the majesty, the fullness of God. And so we tend to see God through our own lens. And then that leads us down the path of racism and all the issues that we find ourselves in today, and as we've been in for thousands of years.
Lynette, would you say the question again?
Well, LeBlanc talks about race being a construct, that we've constructed that. And if we think about that in terms of the image of God, how does that affect how we look at the image of God when we've constructed this racial hierarchy?
Gwinnett, it's
Yes.
Pidge.
Yes.
Possibly I'm thinking of that question as an artist, and I have never even attempted to imagine what God looks like. It's just too mind-boggling. It's difficult enough to find the depictions of Christ that can actually make sense. And John Ryan knows the source of that comment when he came to the DCPC to talk to the search committee. He had a whole group of pictures of Jesus, from looking like a clown to almost an animal. I mean, black, white, orange, green, you know, the most interesting mixture. So I don't think we can even get a full glimpse of Jesus, which I think is better, that we don't visualize it.
There are a number of instances in the Bible where, for instance, in Genesis, God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created him. And even in the New Testament, in Colossians, I've put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge after the image of its creator. So if we think about the body of Christ containing all of the images of humanity, how do we as a church embody that? How do we embody the Imago Dei?
Well, I think our language is a problem. Just like he pointed out, he tried not to use the pronoun or the he, and in the English language, at least, he had a hard time not doing that. And so I think that our problem is sometimes maybe in describing God, we don't have the right words to even do that. So maybe it's almost impossible for us to even describe God or think of God in the way that we should because of our limited vocabulary. And so maybe that's part of our problem.
I think that Jesus stood among us, was one of us, was not something outside of us, but at the heart of us. And told us, showed us, called us, follow me. And we struggle with that, but that is the calling that we are very much aware of as far as what we have been called to be, to follow Jesus, to follow in his footsteps, to care like he cared for us. Something like that.
I was just wondering what effect it would have on our thinking if we had always had pictures in the church as we grew up of Jesus as a Black person. And because the Black culture grew up in this country with pictures of Jesus looking like us. And if we had always been taught that Jesus was another race, I wonder what effect it would have had on us.
I remember once a pastor saying that he had been talking with someone who claimed to be an atheist, and he said, yeah, that God on the Sistine Chapel reaching down to with his finger out, is that the one you don't believe in? And I said, yeah, that's one I don't believe in. And I think so many of us have that image of God, even if we don't really want to acknowledge it, that we have made that kind of image into the image of God. Whereas when we see, again, I think the Jesus example is wonderful. If we can see Jesus in so many forms, although they're always going to be male, but if we can try to see the image of God in everybody we look at, that will just open up our eyes to the wonder of creation and to the love of God.
This is Bob Osborne. I distinctly remember, and maybe Susan will remember this, when we first were leading a disciple class, it may have been disciple 2, I don't remember which one, but Pidge and I went off to Richmond to take lessons so we could learn how to do this, etc. And in one of our first lessons, we sat across from one another and said, "In your face, I see the image of God." And I think if we could somehow just keep that thought in mind and keep that sentence in mind, "In your face, I see the image of God," I think that would be a big help.
This is Susan. I do remember that, Bob, and I remember how powerful it was to look at ourselves from the standpoint of this is the image of God. This is who God has created. And I think if we think about also the indwelling of God's Spirit that somebody's already mentioned, that God really, not only are we made in his image, but his Spirit dwells within each of us. And if we look at our brothers and sisters from that perspective, how much richer our lives would be and how much we perhaps can move toward that new perfection that the video was talking about, the shalom of God that he seeks for all of us. Thanks for that reminder, Bob. I had forgotten about that.
That reminds me of the Indian vow of Namaste, where the divine in me sees the divine and welcomes the divine in you, and regardless of what culture. And that's meant so much to us. Just that little signal.
Just reminded me last week that speaker said the same thing we're talking about now. And he really made an interesting point. He said, whenever, these are my words, not his, but I think this is what he was saying. Whenever we fail to see Christ in another person, whenever we dehumanize another person, we dehumanize Christ and God, because God has made these people in his image. And he used that same word that today's speaker used. In doing that, we break covenant. Remember, today's speaker said that Adam and Eve broke covenant, they didn't sin. We break covenant whenever we fail to see God's image in another human being.
Picking up on that, LeBlanc talked about a coin with two sides, justice on one side and righteousness on the other. And so talk a little bit about what that means to you in terms of, does justice come first, or, you know, righteousness being defined, I think, mainly as a place of holiness. And so how do we arrive at that sense of holiness without justice? What's justice look like in order to arrive at holiness?
I think when he talked about, how the Canadians tried to legislate racism to make people alike, that they were trying to get to justice, I guess, or maybe balance and harmony, as he talked about. But unfortunately, they missed the mark of justice or of righteousness in doing that. And we tend to legislate toward justice instead of legislating toward righteousness, maybe.
My take on that is that righteousness is an unattainable achievement by a human being, that's only one without sin can be totally righteous. Justice is something that God calls on us to pursue in our broken state. And somebody once said to me that Christ's mission to us is to work to build his kingdom on earth. We can't do that purely or wholly, but we can work to build it. And we do that by pursuing justice. Righteousness would come, I would say, in the eschaton. It's something to aspire toward, but none of us can be purely righteous.
And this is Robert. In my devotion this past Monday, I shared a little bit about what I've come to understand righteousness to mean. And for me, it's not so much about perfection as it is about being in right relationship with God and neighbor, fully practicing the love commandments. And I suppose if you are doing that, then you are perfect. But for me, that gives a more, an easier way to connect the justice and righteousness piece, because if I'm not seeking justice in the world, then I'm not honoring the relationships that I have with God and neighbor. And so to pursue fair and equal treatment for all, and to honor my neighbor and to lift up the oppressed in love is it's a crucial part of honoring that relationship. So for me, that's how they fit together.
I have have seen our Black brothers and sisters come into the forefront of late, and they have been marching before us in the streets. And it's sort of like all of a sudden they are in the midst. They're not something sort of out there, sort of behind the bars or whatever. But we're beginning to see that we are one people. And it's sort of, I begin to see that we might get it together as one body, working together in a new way. Even though we're all white right now, it doesn't have to be that way in the churches or in the groups in the future.
That's a good point, John. And Heather, you were talking in the chat about the visualization of God being more than just words. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. We talk about how we see God or Jesus, how how they have been visually depicted throughout history and art, and even in our own mind's eye. But there are also critiques of the church that look at, and I think the speaker alluded to it, is that when Constantine took Christianity and turned it into a state religion, along with that came the structures and the hierarchies of that particular culture. And, over time, that has remained true through Catholicism and then after the Reformation, that we imbue the church with the cultural expectations that we as white people bring to it. And a lot of the critiques around, how can we be church together, coming from the Black community, is that, from what I've heard, is that you all have a certain cultural way of doing things, and it revolves around perfectionism, urgency, this sense of a hierarchical decision-making process that tends to perpetuate itself at the detriment of allowing there to be a more egalitarian type community, more of a beloved community. So just, something to think about too when we think about the image of God. It's not just how we see God, but how we interact in community and how we treat one another.
Thanks, others. Go ahead, Gordon.
I'd like to pick up on John Cox's comments. I think in focusing on this whole idea of justice and righteousness, and as Joe suggested, we may never achieve true righteousness in any particular situation in our lifetime. But Leclerc reminded us that one of our goals, and I think this is certainly true for all of us who take our faith seriously, we can, even though there are many missteps along the way, we should be continuing to live into this realization of God's image. And I see the protests, the marches, which involved a lot of people of various colors and creeds. I think I see that as a march together, arm in arm with people who have been marginalized, as a way of living into the realization of God's image applying to all of us. I think we're at a crucial crossroads right now in terms of this issue in our country and around the world. And I think we have to grasp it arm in arm with our brothers and sisters, and continue to see, or at least pursue, the idea of seeing God and Christ's image in the people we meet and work with in this new movement. This movement that's been waiting 350 years or more to progress.
And so that's a really good point, I think, Gordon. And are there ways in which we as individuals and we as a church can move toward a more dynamic shalom?
Gordon, what you said, and seeing the face of God and the image of God in each of us, I think when that becomes difficult is when we feel like the injustices in the world, when someone's on the other side, the divisiveness in this country, even the people that we passionately disagree with and feel like they're in the wrong, having an ability to still take that approach is probably a path to eventually making progress in that trajectory, as difficult as that might be.
This is Julie. I think one of the other things is we also have to look at ourselves, and we have to be the ones willing to change. Not just y'all come in, come join us. We're glad to have you, but I think we need to go out and change some of the ways we do things. And you know that we are very challenged when it comes to change. My way of doing things, my favorite, whatever, form of music, form of worship, 60 minutes. Don't you dare go over 60 minutes. And so I think we have to challenge ourselves to changing the way we do things and not just expecting folks are going to come to us, because that's not, I think we're called to more than that.
Personally had struggled with what is my role as this has all come to the forefront. And I definitely studied this in college. This is a passion of mine with education. But what is my role, and how do I continue to promote change and justice and all of that? And so, you know, I do believe that we all have talents and skills and things that we can bring to the table, and really looking at what it is we do every day, and how we can incorporate more of the idea of seeing God in each other and justice in what we do. I mean, I'm an administrator at a middle school, and so I think about when I talk to families and children, am I seeing God in them? Am I reacting in a way that shows them that we are all the same people, we are all working together? And so, you know, I guess trying to figure out how I can make a difference without trying to take it all on, because it's too much to say I need to do everything. I need to join in the marches. I need to make sure that I am involved in every community organization. You just can't. But making meaningful impacts in the work we do daily.
That's a really good point, Brittany. And I think we need to think about things that we can do as individuals, and then also look at it from a standpoint of the church in terms of how do we become more welcoming, not only in worship, but in things that we do in the community and interact with. So I think that's one of my hopes out of this, I think, is that we can begin to not only become more aware, but also work towards some ways to kind of come out of the hierarchy maybe of corporate church and begin to be a place where everyone feels welcome. I know that we work toward that, certainly, but I think, like Julie said, we have to probably be willing to make some changes in order to widen the tent that we have. So I guess what LeBlanc is challenging us to do is to think about how do we move in more to the shalom that God has promised us in bringing Jesus to earth. I really liked his idea about, you know, God bringing perfection back to humanity in bringing Christ to earth. So it is kind of overwhelming, like Brittany said, but I think groups like this help us to not only learn, but to figure out ways how in our daily life we can begin to move closer to the shalom of God. So are there any more ideas? Yeah, I think we all are struggling with that.
This is
individually as well as corporately.
Glenn, this is James. I just wanted to say this season our Sunday school lesson is about wisdom, but the last quarter it was about justice. And Heather and Van Leer Logan taught the Maloney class, and we learned in the last quarter that the righteous person pursues justice for the poor and the oppressed. And our lesson this morning talked a little bit about the Gospel of Luke, and the writer of the lesson this morning made the comment that many ministers, when they're preaching the Gospel of Luke, are accused of being partisan, of taking a side. But we know that these are just not partisan issues, that this is why we have our faith. This is the way that we live our lives, to stand up for those that are marginalized and oppressed, and to fight for those that can't fight for themselves. So that's why we have the faith, and it's always a terrible struggle. It's every step is a struggle, but that's why we have our community of faith, to help each other and to encourage each other to keep going and to keep fighting for what's right. So thank you all for your comments and for putting this class on.
Lynette, I think that one of the things that, and I'm going to look to somebody else to get this, the language correct, but Brian Stevenson's comments were about going out and being close to the issues. And I think that, as we're talking about church and Constantine and the hierarchy, I think our call is to go out and be present and understand and build relationships. And then, to some degree, God takes over and helps us see what we need to see. And then, so it's being out of the church more so than being in the church. And, how do we take those steps that are more active steps and less, passive? And, a lot of what our speaker today talked about was being more active in things like equality and fairness. Those are kind of passive to me. Righteousness and justice, they're more active, reactive, proactive, and the key word is active.
And you're right, John. One of the things that Brian also said was be more comfortable with being uncomfortable in certain situations as you move out.
Yes.
One of the challenges right now, of course, is moving out. I'm sitting here feeling uncomfortable, actually, because it's with the coronavirus, and maybe that's just an excuse, but being out in community and being active in trying to bend the arc of whatever the thing is toward justice. I can't remember the word I'm missing, but it's a little bit of a challenge right now. And I know John's extremely active. I try to be active. I think a lot of people on this thing try to be active. But even so, I guess that's part of our fallen nature. We always feel like we come up a little bit short.
Well, this is an unusual time. It may be a time of preparation for us because of the restrictions, but using that to get our minds right or decide how we're going to go out and go to the uncomfortable spots. And, we've got plenty of things in our community and in our state and in our country that can occupy us all based on our gifts and our calling, the nudges that we get from God. But yeah, it's hard to do when you're quarantined, but we won't always be quarantined, I hope.
Well, we've talked about, this is Marjorie, we've talked about how we see things in our mind's eye or through culture. But I think we're going to have to realize that there are so many different ways to see and think about race. And I think somewhat we're taking our blinders off and we're beginning to see differently. And we're opening ourselves up. And I think we need to pray for the right path for each of us. And we need to realize that God's Spirit is at work within us and around us, even though we are quarantined. And but we can still be present in many other ways and look for those ways. And there are many ways out there that we can even do from home. And I like thinking about being active, and I know all of us want that, being active in the church, but being active with the church in the community. And I think if we can think of it as taking our blinders off and receiving the Spirit, that we'll find ways.
And I think that being quarantined really does give us time to kind of reflect and say, gosh, what is important? What can I be doing when I'm out from staying at home? I know I've been thinking about that. You know, what can I do?
Yeah. So this is what I'm saying, just so you want to hear it. As you welcome us into your home each week, we take safety seriously here inside the sanctuary at DCPC. You'll see that.
John, you need to turn your sound off.
Sorry.
Thank you. Go ahead, Dennis.
Dennis, you're muted.
Well, I had pretty much said what I was, that this gives us time to reflect. What might we be doing? How might we be contributing more? So in some way, I hate to say it, but the staying at home may be a blessing and a time that gives us thought and gives us time to think about reevaluating what we do. That's it.
Okay, then we need to use the time well to do exactly that. Let's all pledge to do so. I hope I can.
Well, and I think if race is a construct, then maybe we use this time at home to, like architects, draw up plans to deconstruct, you know, some of the parameters of racism.
If I could just say a couple of things. This is Fahad, by the way. So it was very interesting to see that you know, the conversation started way back in history. We're talking about Constantine's time and the frameworks that have existed, and they sort of permeate every part of our society. So we're having this discussion right now that is sort of framed around faith, but then we hang up and then we go about our lives. You know, we have the judicial system and all the laws and every piece of legislation that is put out there, how we work and how we treat our coworkers or people who work for us. There are hierarchies in all of them, and do we have the wherewithal to address each and every one of those and go back and address them? And it seems like a really overwhelming task, but and the question was, how can we reflect right now, or how can I do my little piece in what I'm doing in my life? I think it would take, I mean, if we really want to do it, then it would take everyone to identify whatever small piece of injustice or hierarchy that we see and try to correct it. Because like, for example, we live in a you know, a law-abiding society, or we strive to, but all of those are sort of written, a lot of them are written for the protection of people who have capital, people who are not poor, not necessarily from the perspective of what is right, what is just, or what is righteous. And in that framework, the people who are poor, the people who are not protected, it's actually further exacerbated because it's like the boot just keeps crushing them. And if we really want to be just, if we really want to be righteous, I think it would take just being vigilant and addressing all of them piecemeal. That's what I'm thinking. Thank you.
And I'm also reminded that Brian Stevenson in his talks talked about start local. You know, it's a smaller piece of the pie, but I think you're right that we have to, when something that we feel like is unjust happens, we have to be ready and willing and able to say something at that point, not to just let that injustice stay.
This is Mary Kim. Fahad, you made me think of something I've been reading. Has anyone else had a look at, I want to say her name is Jennifer Harvey, How to Raise White Children, White Kids? Anyway, I've been reading it. It's interesting. But the main takeaway I got from her yesterday was, well, the question was how to be a healthy white person. It's a paradox. We're living in a paradox to be white. On the one hand, we want to be comfortable in our own skin, and I'm talking about white people, and not live a life of shame and guilt, right? But on the other, we all have to recognize that the system, like Todd was talking about, is built for white people. And we all have to take stock and recognize that, you know, white people were born white by chance. I mean, we're not all to bear full responsibility for the way things are, but we have to recognize that each and every one of us has benefited from the system in some way. There's absolutely no denying that. So if you can internalize that and accept that and recognize that life in America is for white people, built on all the way back to the founding of the country, the concept of white supremacy. We have to recognize that and understand it and live our lives in a way that's sympathetic to those who aren't. I've had a lot of conversations with other friends who say, you know, oh, I grew up with not a lot of money. I worked hard, and I don't understand why it's so great to be white. And I ask yourself this question: would you ever trade places with a person of a Black person, for example? I mean, it's a hard question to ask, but we really have to recognize that. And that's part of being a healthy white person, I think, is what Jennifer Harvey was trying to say. That's all.
Well, and I think last week, someone talked about at a candy store, and white people can come in and buy any candy in the store at all, whereas a Black person would come in and only be able to buy a licorice stick or something. So that image was helpful to me, at least. And so I think that's our challenge, is how do we expand the opportunities for all? So we've got a couple more weeks to work on that with this group. And I appreciate the fact that you were all here this morning. And John Quinn is going to close us in prayer. John?
Let us bow our heads. Dear Lord, thank you for your message delivered today by Terry LeBlanc. Please help us understand your will for us personally and corporately. Please remind us that you commanded us to love our neighbor as ourselves. We have not always done that, and we're understanding our nation's history and the sins of society that did not heed your will. Help us understand this human invention of race, segregation that was created in an imperfect world and limited the potential of so many people that you created. Give us the energy to seek to understand and then to do your will. In Jesus' name we pray, amen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lynette.
May you all have a good
Lynette.
week.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.